When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. But Thomas, who was called the Twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas doubted. So do I. Here are some of the doubts that race through my mind sometimes. Crossing the sea of reeds, dry shod? Come on. Water flowing from the rock, manna falling from the sky, pillar of fire leading them through the night, slaughtering armies 10 times their size through the power of God alone, healing the deaf, the blind, the dumb. Come on. And worst of all, coming back to life after death. Come on, you can't be serious. Perfectly justifiable thoughts, all these. Perfectly justifiable doubts. You may well have thought them and felt them 100 times. I know I have. And after the thoughts and doubts comes the Thomas cry to God. "Show yourself, prove it. Look, I just do not believe this nonsense anymore. What's going on?" And then, like Thomas, in our desperation, we try to reach out, to touch God, to feel him, to touch him, to prove it to ourselves, to get over this nonsense of the totally unbelievable that is being doshed out to us by the people all around us, to get over this pain of collapsing faith, to just get over this unbearable tension of believing these totally weird things that are just totally impossible to believe in anymore. But when these probing, searching, conflict-ridden fingers of ours try to reach out, to touch God, to feel him, to touch him, to prove it to ourselves, to get over this nonsense of the totally unbelievable that is being doshed out to us by all the people around us. When these probing, searching, conflict-ridden fears of ours finally do reach their destination in God, we let out a sudden cry of shock and pain recoil in horror. Why? Because we find that these doubting, probing, proof-seeking, show yourself God shouting fingers of ours are not where we thought they'd be. No, they are not where we thought they'd be, touching something marvellous, touching something wonderful, touching something beautiful, touching something awe-inspiring. Instead, our fingers are finding themselves touching something horrible, are finding themselves touching something rotten and deep and raw within the tortured, gory flesh of an open and seeping wound. How can this be? We shriek out in terror. What's going on? That's not what God is supposed to be like. How can touching God mean holding our hands deep inside the hole of an openly seeping wound? That's even worse than the nonsense we were trying to disprove or be shut of or be done with or grow out of before we reached out our hand. God is an openly seeping wound. That's what we found out. That's horrible. That's worse. God is an openly seeping wound. Here is another cliff we've come to. First, hopes and dreams dashed. Second, torn apart by grief and agony and guilt at our own treatment of Jesus when we denied him and crushed his vision and substituted our own vision. Third, crippling doubt. Fourth, worse than these, forgetting Jesus completely by going back to doing exactly what we were doing before on the Sea of Galilee because we just couldn't think what else we could do. And now this, the final precipice. God is an open, seeping wound. It's just too much. I can't cope. I just can't cope. Yes, that's right. I can't cope. The first statement I've come up with in all this terrible turmoil that is absolutely 100% correct. I can't cope. But God can. Something is about to happen. Something incredible. Something unutterable. Something beyond belief. Something impossible. Something. I don't have the words. Let's listen. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side.